Hello, my name is William Howard. I've been a member of the Connolly Association for the past number of years now. On top of that, I also work as an organiser with Unite the Union, which is, depending on who you ask, the biggest or the second biggest union in Britain at the moment. I wanted to talk a bit today about the Connolly Association itself and the work we do, what we want to achieve, and also on the issue of trade union organising and how that relates to what we do as well in a wider context. So, as many of you will know, the Connolly Association is the oldest migrant workers association in Britain. It has a lineage going back over almost 80 years, goes back to 1938. We're an independent organisation in the sense that we're non-party political. We do draw members from different strata of different political backgrounds in what sense, but the things that unify us are kind of the three goals that we have, if you wish. Is first is the campaign for Irish independence in Britain, to organise to Irish working class in Britain, and to win over the British labour movement to the cause of Irish unity. And it's those kind of things that bring us together. So a key element of what we did as well, historically we provided welfare for Irish immigrants who were coming over and tried to organise them to fight for better conditions for themselves, and a key part of that is encouraging Irish workers to work alongside their British brothers and sisters in the labour movement. It's very important to kind of stress that the association believes that Irish independence doesn't necessarily mean a contradiction between British and Irish workers, or between the Irish working class and the British working class. Their interests as workers are obviously the same, and in fact, the disentangling of Britain from its last colony, and the end of that sort of imperialism in itself will be beneficial for both the Irish and the British working class. And that's what we do. So to tell you a bit more about myself, I suppose I've been in this country for maybe 11 years now. I'm former construction worker, and it was kind of working in construction which has often been a very traditionally Irish pursuit in London, is kind of what gave me an insight into the importance of organisation, the importance of trade unions, and also the importance of a vehicle that would relate to Irish workers and try and empower them and to try and organise them as well. A lot of you will be familiar with the conditions in building sites, which are, although been a bit better now, even I remember back in the early 2000s, were not the best at all, in terms of health and safety, in terms of bogus self-employment, in terms of not having a voice at work, in terms of kind of a bullying and an intimidating atmosphere. And it's something that's plagued the industry going back since forever, really. So not to dwell on my own personal story, but it was kind of through joining Unite. I initially started working with migrant workers who were cleaners from Latin America. We were providing English classes for them with a view to trying to use a hook to bring them in. And then when we were teaching them English and whatnot as well, we were also talking to them about issues at work, about organising, about the union, about the importance of becoming of collective endeavour to make things better, and it was through that I eventually found myself working for Unite. I work as an organiser. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the kind of work that I do at the moment, which is predominantly working with local authorities, and within those local authorities specifically people who work in what's termed environment or waste. So in common terms, people like bin men, road sweepers, and those who do kind of maintenance like on parks and public areas and things along those lines. They're a group of workers that's been hugely overlooked traditionally. They're often it's a job that's often unfortunately carried a lot of stigma. The people who do it are very proud people. They do a very vital and a very necessary job, but they're often people who've been kind of looked down upon, in the sense not sometimes by the general public, and most certainly by the local authorities they work for. A huge issue that has afflicted that kind of job and resulted in it becoming a much poorer quality of job to be doing is the phenomenon of outsourcing. Something that's not unique to local authorities, but something that's a very prevalent and very destructive factor that's ongoing at the moment. And when we say outsourcing, what it would mean is privatisation, essentially, whereby a local authority where it would have used to provide its own services and have the workers working in-house directly for the council will bring in a third party. Some of the names that you might be familiar with will be Veolia or Basser, and another big one that's becoming much more kind of prevalent in waste is Serco. Serco are currently mired in a huge controversy after receiving £12 billion in public money to provide a track and trace system that doesn't work. So it also has extremely close links to the Conservative Party and to the British establishment in general. You know, it's been referred to as the industrial wing of the Conservative Party by some, you know. And the effect that this has is if you privatise a service and basically give it to a private company, what you've then done is encourage them to take a very necessary and very important social service and to drive that not on the basis of need or on the welfare of the people delivering it, but to drive it on the basis of how much profit you can make for yourself. So we're sold this myth that privatisation of public services will result in greater efficiency, a happier workforce, and saving the taxpayer money, while in every metric that has been proved to be false. I mean, if you look at the fact that Serco have been kicked out of the NHS numerous times, if you look at the debacle that G4S made of the Olympics, for instance, if you know, the public services are littered with tales of private companies just being bloated, inefficient, and simply profit-driven machines, and absolutely miserable places to work, and often delivering a substandard service. The ways in which they do this is they will try and cut staff to the bone. For instance, you can slash the wage bill. You know, that's more money you can stick in your pocket. Driving down terms and conditions, freezing pay, bringing in loads of agency workers on terrible terms and conditions with no pensions. Accompanied with that then is the rise in precarity, whereby you mightn't know if you have work from week to week, you're not paying any sick pay, you're not paying any pensions. So what you have is a kind of a burn and churn system where instead of having, taking a socially necessary job and having that as a decent place to work, what you do is you just take an axe to it and use it for short-term profit. So the solution that we've tried to identify to that, obviously without sounding hackneyed, is to organise, is to try and to fight back. So it started off about a year and a half ago in Newham, where you had a group of workers. They were extremely divided amongst themselves. They were divided amongst different shifts. They were divided amongst different jobs. They were divided amongst race, which was a huge issue. And they were also very cynical and very apathetic over the years, due to just being constantly mistreated and just constantly seeing the job run down with very little recourse to do anything about it. So what we decided to do was to try and organise and fight back. Something that we did, we managed to overcome these divisions. We managed to ballot for strike action, and what we got was full regrading, which resulted in basically a life-changing pay rise for these sort of workers. On the back of that, we thought, if we can have this success in Newham, and if we can overcome such a divided division within the workplace, what's happening in the rest of London? And the more we looked at different boroughs, the more we saw that the issues in the job were completely rife. It brought us into struggles in Hackney, in Tower Hamlets, where we had an inspirational strike action that was later successful. It also resulted in this year in Bexley, a place where we had 19% membership at the start, and ended up getting up to 95 union percent membership density, 95% membership density. Again, that was dealing with Serco, a company that presided over bullying, presided over low pay, with some of the workers being paid as little as £8.90 an hour, presided over 0 hours contracts, health and safety violations, all of these sort of things. And what we did in Bexley was we decided that a key element of our industrial strategy wouldn't just be organising ballot for strike, it would also be to try and drag the council into it. Because after all, the council, a Tory council, Priti Patel's husband, I believe, is one of the main kind of cabinet members in it, basically took all of our hard-working bin men, privatised them out to Serco, and then washed their hands of them. And when we kind of raised the concerns, they said, it's nothing to do with us. It's Serco as your employer. We have nothing to do with it anymore. Which is ridiculous, really, because we were collecting the council's bins, we were sweeping the council's roads, we were maintaining the council's parks. The idea that, we had nothing to do with the council is a fiction. And you've seen this more and more in outsourcing, where employers and local authorities will basically, use this as a convenient dumping ground for workers. And what we decided was, that if the council is going to preside over life-changing detrimental cuts to our salaries and to our well-being, we are going to make sure that we will inform their neighbours and their friends about the real life effects of the decisions that these people are making. So on the day we had a rock solid picket. No wagons went in and no wagons went out. And very interestingly, on the second day of the strike, we had council officers down there. Oh, what's happening? So the key lesson that we learned here is that when you're dealing with outsourcing, don't just focus on the outsourcer, who's essentially a middleman. Go straight to the client, drag them into it, and hold people account, hold the decision makers account for their actions. Interestingly enough, immediately we had the police try and break up our picket. We had police physically push over a pregnant woman onto the ground. We had them physically trying to drag people off the picket. And it's also a lesson for those who are willing or who are concerned with trying to change society that, if you have a burglary, for instance, the police might call around to your house and be perfectly pleasant and be perfectly decent people. If you try and organise a picket, the police will send in riot squads to beat you over the head. I mean, that's essentially their purpose in society, is to maintain and defend the status quo. Needless to say, if you're organised, if you're solid enough, as we were, you can push that back. And we did, and we won. And the strike won, again, made life-changing difference to these workers. We won £1 on the hour. We won full company sick pay, which previous they didn't get any sick pay, so they had to choose between coming into work sick or staying at home poor. We managed to beat that back at full company sick pay. The agency workers there were given positions, full-time positions, so what we did was undercut the precarity. And lastly, the local management were basically sacked and transferred, the local bullying management. And the new management that replaced them were going to think twice about trying to push people around, because they knew that they weren't dealing with individuals, they were dealing with a collective, organised body of working class people. Interestingly enough, a few months ago they tried to victimise the rep on some vexatious nonsense and tried to sack him. And the lads just said, well, we're staying in the cabin. We're not going out to work until this is thrown out. And needless to say, it was thrown out that day. Again, a reminder that these sort of victories and these organising victories and initiatives, they're not kind of one shot victories. It's a struggle. It is called the class struggle for a reason, is that these things are going to be never ending. They're all, capital is always going to try and push back against labour. It's always going to try and maximise its own returns, and it's up to workers to be constantly organised and constantly vigilant and constantly prepared to push back on that and to stand up for their interests. And that means developing sustainable organisations. It means training reps. It means building our capacity, and it means building institutions for working class people whereby they're able to resist, not just in the short term but in the long term, and also to go on the offensive. On the back of these kind of issues, we're now currently about to ballot for strike in Thurrock in Essex, where the council are trying to basically cut the refuse workers and street cleansers pay by between £2,000 and £3,000. Funnily enough, get clapped in the streets 1 minute and then suffer a pay cut the next. Same in Croydon as well. We're gearing up on the issues of bullying and low pay and whatnot as well there. So the message has spread, and the lesson that we've managed to get from the initial victory in Newham and to bring it around into all these other boroughs is that we have power when we're organised. We don't have to have this sure it's going to happen anyway apathetic mindset. There are strategies we can employ that that will result in victory. We've built everything in this world, and this world can't run without us. So while I've spoken a lot about individual boroughs, just to kind of give you an idea, is that the next year what we want to do is to take the leaders and take the representatives from all these different boroughs and bring them together in a combine, by which, instead of organising, instead of simply looking, I'm a worker in Croydon, I'm a worker in Haringey, what we do is we organise the job. I'm a bin man in London, I'm a street cleanser in London, I'm a parks maintenance worker in London, and we organise around that job, and we say, this is the minimum that we will accept. We will accept a minimum of X pounds an hour. We will accept a minimum of company sick pay. We want this sort of an agency contract whereby you're given a permanent position after 10 weeks or something along those lines. And that way then you're acting as a job and you're trying to raise the collective conditions in that. That's what was done to great success by other unions, namely the Teamsters in America and whatnot. I think it's very important that we don't focus on simply one area, is that we look at entire industries, we look at whole geographical areas, and then we try and create the sense of a movement. And the people who are driving that aren't union organisers like myself or union officers or anything like that. It's these workers themselves. It's by taking the organisers and leaders in each area and bringing them together. that I believe personally is the future of where we need to be going as a group of workers, as a class, if you will. And Irish people have a massive role to play in that, in the industries that we work in. We have a huge history of Irish trade unionism in this country. It's something that we need to continue. I'd urge anyone who's not in a trade union to join one, to get their friends to join one, and to basically understand the economic process of what's happening at the moment, whereby we are going to be made to carry the can for the current crisis, and for us to reject that and to say that we refuse to do it, and more importantly to back that up with some organisation. So sorry if I've rambled on a bit there. That's just a bit about what we're doing at the moment. Thanks.
Hello all, and welcome to today's podcast, which is in relation to James Larkin, a focus on his life and a focus on his legacy and how he has been remembered. My name is Declan Doolin, and I've been asked as part of the Connolly Association to conduct today's podcast. So I do hope you all enjoy. I hope you can sit back and relax and learn a little bit about James Larkin as well, who was a truly significant Liverpudlian Scouse-Irish hero. James Larkin was born in 1876 in Liverpool to Irish parents, on Combermere Street near Toxteth in the south end of the city. Liverpool was one of the most poorest parts of the United Kingdom at this time, and it is here, through this fact, that Larkin was influenced by socialist ideologies at this time, having witnessed what was going on around him in terms of the rising number of poverty on the streets of Liverpool. Larkin became the national organiser of the Liverpool-based National Union of Dock Labourers in 1901. As part of this role, he was sent to Belfast in 1907 during the years of the Belfast Workers' Revolts. It was here, as has been described by Larkin, started his journey of changing the course of the Irish political sphere. This is in relation to the fact that it was here that Belfast workers lacked rights and there was a lack of union power in the city. Larkin led the Belfast dock strikes in 1907, but this was done by Larkin to unite both Catholics and Protestants and to stop the sectarian divide that was happening in Ireland at this time. The socialist politics of Larkin saw the workers as one, and religion was an irrelevant context in this term. He called on all of the workers to stand up against the bosses, and that capitalism was the real enemy. The real shock for Larkin was when he visited Dublin in 1907. He saw the extent of poverty. Dublin was one of the most poorest parts of Europe at this time. 26,000 families lived in 5,000 decaying tenements. It was clearly not fit for purpose. The working class of Dublin were impoverished, disorganised, and without meaningful representation. This led to Larkin forming the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in 1909. The Irish Transport General Workers Union started off as a hugely successful organisation. This is a result of the organisation becoming the biggest trade union in Ireland at the time. In 1911, the organisation had 5,000 members. By 1913, it had 10,000 members. This demonstrates and signifies the importance of what Larkin did due to the fact that he appealed to the masses. The ITGWU joined Larkin's other creation, which was the Irish Labour Party in 1912. The Irish Labour Party's aims was to create a fair society for all. Larkin and Connolly at this time became extremely close, and Connolly famously stated that Larkin was a man of genius and was in awe of his socialistic policies and tendencies. One of the major successes of the growth in the members of Larkin's new trade union was his ability to engage with his audience. This was recalled by the famous Irish Republican Countess Markievicz in 1911. She said it seemed as if personality caught up, assimilated, and threw back the vast crowd that surrounded him every emotion that swayed him. Every pain that had felt made articulate and sacrificed. This clearly shows the magnitude of Larkin at this time. Larkin's ability to organise the unions and the working class led to one of the most significant disputes in Irish history, the Dublin lockout in 1913. This was significant in a sense. It was one of the largest disputes between the working classes and the capitalist bosses. In 1913, 25,000 workers went on strike because of their refusal to sign an oath to leave Larkin's trades union, which was led by William Murphy at the time. On the 31st of August 1913, an incident known as Bloody Sunday occurred when the police battened charged hundreds of strikers and resulted in many injuries, with 2 strikers dying as a result. The lockout ended in early 1914. It was a defeat for the trade union at the time, but it was significant in a way that it was the first step towards Irish independence in the way that the Irish people stand up to the British Crown at this time. The Dublin lockout was very significant in terms of the demand for women's suffrage. Larkin supported women's suffrage, and this can be seen through his famous speech at the graveside of Alice Brady, a Labour activist who died because of the shooting in 1914 at the Dublin lockout strikes. He said, "In their 17 weeks' fight, no section had shown more pluck, endurance and solidarity than the women workers." It shows the significance of what Larkin believed for women. Soon after the lockout, Larkin was arrested, and with this, he was blamed for the defeat of the lockout by the working classes, who saw him as responsible for the demise of the trade union movement. As a result of this and a result of the hatred by the working classes, Larkin saw himself as a failure and emigrated to America in 1914. Larkin's famous involvement in socialism in America came from his demand for equality for the mine and workers trade union. It was his involvement in this campaign for equality that led to a massive industrial action throughout America in 1916. Historian Donal claimed that Larkin became a lecturer, a union organiser, and a socialist agitator during his time in America. Larkin, in 1918, formed the left-wing section of the Socialist Party in America, where they had 110,000 members. Larkin became a regular organiser of industrial action in America, and as a result of this, he became a massive threat to the American government, who saw him as a socialist alien. James Larkin was labelled a violent anarchist by the New York Times in 1919. In 1920, he was arrested due to the fear of socialism at this time. During his time in prison, he was visited by the famous orator Charlie Chaplin. The fact he was visited by Chaplin signifies the effect he had on people, and indeed how intriguing this man was. James Larkin returned to Ireland in 1923 and became instantly involved in the Labour Party, becoming an elected member of the Dáil Éireann on many occasions. He subsequently, after years of being involved in socialism, died in 1947 at the age of 71. He was buried at Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. So how has James Larkin been remembered? I would say Larkin has been remembered profoundly across the globe. An example of this can be seen by his statue erected on Dublin's O'Connell Street in 1979. The significance of Larkin with his hands up in the air conducting a speech signifies how he has been remembered by the Irish people in positive light. James Larkin has also had a profound effect upon Liverpool's Irish community. This can be seen by the creation of the James Larkin Society in 2001 by Barry and Tony O'Hara in Liverpool. The society has organised various commemorations and events to the Liverpool City Centre throughout the last 20 years. And this is significant in the sense that Larkin has been commemorated not just by Ireland people actually born in Ireland, but also the Scouse Irish in Liverpool. I would just like to finish this podcast video to commemorate not just James Larkin, but also our Liverpool Irish hero, Tony O'Hara, who recently passed away. Tony was a stalwart of the Irish community in Liverpool. He was co-founder of the James Larkin Society in Liverpool, and he'll be missed dearly. He's done a lot of great work for the James Larkin Society in Liverpool, also for the Irish community. So I do want to pay tribute and then end on a note to Tony O'Hara, who is deeply missed here in Liverpool. And now we come to the end of this podcast. So I do hope you've all enjoyed. I hope you carry on learning about Liverpool Irish history and in particular about Larkin. And I hope we can continue these events as they are important, even though we are in strange times at the moment with coronavirus. It's important that we do keep in touch with our Irish history, especially our Liverpool Irish history. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
This year's annual Armistice Day commemorations recently took place, as well as an event to remember the return of the unknown warrior to London. And watching those events on the news made me think a lot about the last few weeks of the Brigades' time in Spain and their return to their own countries. The last battle of the Brigades took part in, including my father, Sam Wilde, and many of the Irish Brigaders, was the Battle of the Ebro, the last doomed Republican offensive of the war and the last battle the Brigaders were engaged in before their final withdrawal from Spain. I knew something about the Battle of the Ebro, but it wasn't until I visited the area that I really began to understand the toll, both physically and emotionally, that battle must have had on those fighting. The area around the River Ebro is an area of huge, steep, bare mountainsides. Fighting in that tough, unforgiving terrain must have been horrendous. Bill Alexander, one of the commanders, wrote, "Conditions in the battalion were almost beyond description. The men were emaciated and exhausted from the heat, from inadequate food, lack of water and sleep. Their boots were cut to pieces. The collection and removal of the wounded was difficult, painful for the wounded, and physically and emotionally exhausting for those who carried them." Jack Jones was one of those wounded in the battle for Hill 481. He recalled, "Suddenly my shoulder and right arm went numb. I could do nothing but lie where I was. Near me, a comrade had been killed, and I could hear the cries of others complaining of their wounds. The stretcher bearers were doing their best, but could hardly keep up with the numbers of the casualties." After 13 days of continuous action, the British battalion was moved into reserve. Only 150 of the 558 who had crossed the River Ebro still remained. On August the 11th, the battalion was recalled to defend Hill 666. With no transport available, they marched across country from Gandesa and then faced another 11 days of hell on the mountains of the Ebro. Fascist bombers came over 60 to 100 at a time from dawn to dusk. All the British had to respond with was rifle and machine gun fire. First aider Menai Williams said, "It was the worst time in the war. Not for terror, I'd got over that. The agony was that I could do nothing for the wounded. Day and night we were bombarded by aircraft, mortars, shelling, and there was no cover. The casualties were horrendous. It was a big open-air abattoir." And the historian Anthony Beaver describes how the fascist aerial bombardment was so fierce that the Republican soldiers hung pieces of wood around their necks and they'd bite on them to help them endure the ordeal. The battalion was commended for their bravery on Hill 666, but it had been at a massive cost. On the 21st of September 1938, Juan Negrin, the Prime Minister of the Republic, announced the decision to repatriate all the international brigades from action in Spain in a vain attempt to secure help from Britain and France to mediate peace with Franco. Rumours that the international brigades were to be disbanded were sweeping through the Republican lines. Inevitably, there was some relief, but also deep sorrow that the Spanish people would be left to fight on alone. But on the 23rd of September, before the recall could be put into effect, the battalion was called into action for one last time. Tommy Bloomfield recalled, All the lads went back in. That was a hard decision to make, knowing it meant you could die instead of going home. A great many men who 24 hours earlier had been talking of returning home never made it back. One of them was George Green from Stockport. In previous action, he had been wounded and treated by his wife Nan Green, a nurse in Spain. Learning of the coming withdrawal of the international brigades, George had insisted on returning to take part in the final action with his comrades. George died in the last hour of fighting, leaving behind his wife Nan and their 2 children. Despite their bravery, the British battalion was outnumbered and outgunned. Raw courage and a belief in the rightness of their cause could not overcome the superior military force of the nationalists. Only 137 brigaders were left. Peter Kerrigan described it as the cutting to pieces of our very bravest. Saying farewell to their Spanish comrades who were returning to the front must have been so painful. My father, Sam Wilde, presented the battalion banner to the Spanish commander, Captain Cipriano. The Spaniards formed lines and sang the Republican national anthem as they set off once again back to the front. Edwin Greening watched through floods of tears. Finally, he said, the now completely Spanish 35th Division formed ranks and marched to the west, back to the Ebro Holocaust, while we foreign volunteers marched in the opposite direction, towards the east. It was a tragic and heartbreaking end to the Brigaders' role in Spain. The Brigaders were taken to Barcelona by lorry. Fred Thomas, sitting in the lorry with a friend, said, "We sat somberly, sadness and joyous relief making a hash of our emotions. If either of us wondered what had been achieved since we went over that pontoon bridge on the 26th of July, that thought remained unspoken." Away from the front, the Brigaders heard of the sellout by Britain and France of Czechoslovakia. A Brigader recalled listening to Bob Cooney, and in the darkened church where we were billeted, we listened to Bob telling us about the Munich settlement, and we knew it wasn't bringing us peace, it was bringing more war. How right they were. The final appearance of the battalion was at the farewell parade in Barcelona on the 28th of October. Leading Republican figures thanked the international brigades. Dolores Ibarori, La Pasionaria, and my namesake, told the brigaders in her rousing speech, "You can go proudly. You are history. You are legend. And we will not forget you." Fred Thomas captured the emotion of the occasion. For an hour and a half we made our way through the streets. I was not the only brigader reduced to tears. We who were leaving the fight were receiving the heartfelt homage of the Spanish people. And Edwin Greening recalled, "We were glad the unequal struggle was over, but sad that the people of Spain were being left to fight it out against the combined might of fascist forces." Just after midnight on the 6th of December, the 320 men of the British battalion marched through the streets of Rappeau to the railway station. They left at dawn to the sound of a military band playing the Internationale and the cheers of the local population. Fred Thomas recalled, as our train pulled out of the station, we saw, as a last reminder of Spanish friendship, elderly Jose from our favourite cafe waving his Republican flag and calling out, "Long live our British comrades, long live the International Brigades." And with unbelievable generosity, for Spanish people were starving, we were issued with a tin of bully beef for the journey. Percy Ludwig remembered, the last person we saw on Spanish soil was an old peasant woman dressed in black, standing by the railway embankment. She raised her right hand as we passed and gave us the clenched fist Popular Front salute. The 320 Brigaders arrived in New Haven by ferry on the 7th of December and then travelled to Victoria Station in London by train. Even though their return had only been announced the day before, thousands of people were there to greet them, Labour and Communist dignitaries and trade unionists. My father and Bob Cooney responded to the speeches from the dignitaries before the Brigaders moved off. Bob Cooney described the scene. At Sam's command, we formed up behind flags of all the nations whose sons had made Spain's cause their cause. I will never forget the scene that followed. Drums and bugles were drowned out by the cheers of the welcoming crowd. It seemed all London was there to welcome us. The line of police, arms interlocked, sweated and strained in a vain effort to hold the crowd back. In the end, they gave up the struggle, and some of them added their cheers to those of the crowd. The Brigaders raised their banner and, led by 3 wounded men, the battalion marched together for the last time out of the station and into the world outside. The next day, December the 8th, the News Chronicle reported, led proudly by their wounded comrades, the men marched into London. With them marched the spirit of Byron, the Tolpuddle Martyrs, the Chartists and Keir Hardie. Behind and around them marched 20,000 British Democrats. Men as well as women wept and cheered. It was no political affair, for all parties were represented, both on the platform and in the crowd. It was British democracy spontaneously expressing its abhorrence of fascism and its appreciation of bravery. These men have made history by forming part of the greatest international democratic army the world has ever known. They have inspired the world by their example. And something of this seemed to enter into everyone who was at Victoria Station last night, and the memory of it will never be eradicated. In their final days in Spain, the battalion had made the following pledge. They said, "We are returning to our respective countries, not for celebrations in our honour, not to rest, but to continue the fight we helped to wage in Spain. The British battalion is prepared to carry on the work begun here, to ensure that our 500 comrades who sleep forever beneath the Spanish soil, shall serve as an example to the entire British people in the struggle against fascism. We intend to keep the promise we made to the Spanish people before we left. We are merely changing the front on which we fight and the weapons that we use. And in different ways, individually and collectively, the great majority of the volunteers kept that pledge.
Friends, my thank you for the invitation to partake in this year's online commemoration of the Manchester Martyrs. And it's important, in these most unusual times, and they are unusual times, to continue with these important traditions and to learn from the past. Here in Ireland, our own ongoing decade of centenaries has very much been impacted too. But where there's a will, there is always a way. We should be commemorating the events of Bloody Sunday 1920 in Dublin this weekend. And recently we had the centenary of the death of Kevin Barry. But like you, so much of our commemoration is now done online. I look forward to all those 101st anniversaries next year. It's been a joy to participate in these commemorations and discussions in Manchester over the years, and I look forward to being able to do that again in the future. I think the story of the Manchester Martyrs is significant for all kinds of different reasons. It demonstrates the deep community of the Irish in Manchester, a city that had its own little Ireland. I think commemorating the Manchester Martyrs, an event that was never forgotten among that Irish diaspora, and the fact that it's still honoured annually is quite remarkable. The annual November commemorations were and are at the heart of Irish identity there. It also invites us, I think, to explore Fenianism more broadly and to look at the context in which these men and the cause for which these men gave their lives. Fenianism was, at its core, internationalist. In fact, it was born on St. Patrick's Day, 1858, of the Irish diaspora in the United States of America. Wherever there was an Irish diaspora, from Australia to Canada, the United States, Salford, Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow, there was always a Fenian presence. On one level, the events that we're talking about, the death of the Manchester Martyrs, might seem far removed from the more recent revolutionary story that Ireland's been commemorating in recent times. But on another level, these events are deeply interlinked. How many people know, for example, that one of those involved in the smashing of the van in Manchester, James Stritch, was himself later part of the GPO garrison and participated in the 1916 Easter Rising. There's an intersection between these two stories. They're not as far removed as you may think. And to the 1916 generation, the Fenian Uprising of 1867 was not a distant history, but a living history. They found themselves fighting alongside a veteran of it in the GPO. It was central, undoubtedly, to radicalising the 1916 generation too, and it was an annual tradition in which the revolutionary generation always participated. For me, my first exposure to the Manchester Martyrs was a grave in Glasnevin Cemetery. When visiting it as a youngster, I remember seeing this grave with the names of these men and being told by my father that they were, in fact, not buried there, but that tens of thousands of people had marched to Glasnevin Cemetery in a procession on the 8th of December 1867 behind 3 empty hearses, where there were similar mock funerals right across the island of Ireland. So it made me curious, who are these men? Why the grave, the headstone, but no bodies in a cemetery in Dublin? And speaking of the intersections between the 1916 Rising and the Fenians of 1867, I think it is worth saying that the proclamation of 1867, in many ways, while it's a much less familiar document to Irish people today than the 1916 proclamation, it is a document that is dripping in radicalism. In fact, in many ways, more radical than that which followed it. We therefore declare that, unable longer to endure the curse of monarchical government, we aim at founding a republic based on universal suffrage, which shall secure to all the intrinsic value of their labour. The soil of Ireland, at present in the possession of an oligarchy, belongs to us, the Irish people, and to us it must be restored. We declare also in favour of absolute liberty of conscience and complete separation of church and state. Republicans of the entire world, our cause is your cause, our enemy is your enemy. Let your hearts be with us. As for you, workmen of England, it is not only your hearts we wish, but your arms. Remember the starvation and degradation brought to your firesides by the oppression of labour. An incredible document, sharply secular and republican. That proclamation is also deeply class conscious, agitating against the property rights of an economic oligarchy, contrasting aristocratic leeches, as it calls them, with the popular classes, the real owners of the soil, and even referring to the oppression of the working class and promising the people of Ireland the intrinsic value of their labour. What an incredible document. The Ireland that the Fenians aimed to liberate in 1867 was, it must be remembered, less than 20 years removed from the devastating Gurta Mór, or the Great Hunger of the 1840s, a period in which more than 1 million Irish people lost their lives at home, of starvation and disease attributed to malnourishment, while in excess of 1 million of us left the island of Ireland. Ireland's population was largely disenfranchised by the 1860s. Even after the 1850 Reform Act was introduced in Britain, it broadened the electorate to every man with property worth over £12. 1/3 of Englishmen have been granted the vote as a result. In Ireland, it was fewer than 1 in 6, indeed closer to 1 in 7. Ireland was not a nation defined by her industries. Ireland was defined by her absence of industries. And as a result of Irish poverty, the Fenian movement was largely drawn from the working classes, rank-and-file artisans and urban workers. Karl Marx maintained that Fenianism was characterised by a socialistic tendency and by being a lower orders movement. The movement took root and is still really rooted only in the mass of the people. The father figure of the Fenian movement, James Stephens, was steeped in European revolutionary politics. He took tremendous influence in the First International, in the emergence of Marx and his thinking. But Marx and Engels also took a very keen interest in the emergence of the Fenians and the direction in which this Irish radical movement was going. I think Fenianism was particularly frightening to the authorities because it was a movement that existed on both sides of the Atlantic. Simultaneously with its founding in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day, 1858, Fenianism had also established itself in New York City on that same date and spread into every significant town and city in North America. The North American experience also gave Fenians a taste of war. Many participated in the American Civil War within the Union Army. And the experience of fighting in the American Civil War, I think, hungered many to fight for an Irish Republic at home. The Fenians struck blows in North America too, with a number of raids across the border into Canada in the years before the 1867 rebellion in Ireland. There's a tendency now to joke about these Fenian invasions of Canada, but the largest of those so-called Fenian raids saw a force of approximately 850 Canadian soldiers engaging Fenian forces. And notably, that was the first time that the name IRA, Irish Republican Army, was carried into battle. The Fenians themselves had a popular contemporary song that joked, "We are the Fenian Brotherhood, we're skilled in the art of war, and we're going to fight for Ireland, the land that we adore. Many battles we have won, along with the boys in blue, and we'll go and capture Canada, for we've nothing else to do." There was plenty to do, and the Fenian movement knew it. In the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, a new leadership emerged, which in many ways was spearheaded by Irish-American officers and veterans of that conflict who were eager to go. And this was the first time, but certainly not the last time, that an Irish revolutionary movement drew so heavily on the support, the funding and the military expertise of Irish America. The fingerprints of those Irish-American Civil War veterans are all over the 1867 proclamation. And its likely author was Colonel Thomas J. Kelly, a Union Civil War veteran who emigrated to America as an 18-year-old from Galway. Both Kelly and Deasy, who the crowds in Manchester fought so hard to free, were veterans of the war in America. Fenianism in Ireland had succeeded in doing some remarkable things in the 1860s. Major infiltration of the British Army, for example. At one point, the prominent Fenian John Devoy, Patrick Pearse later described him as the greatest of the Fenians, estimated that as many as 8,000 of the 26,000 British troops stationed on the island of Ireland were secretly members of the Fenian Brotherhood, just waiting for their moment to rise. But when word of that kind of infiltration reached the upper echelons of the British Army, a simple solution was found. Many units populated by Irish soldiers were moved abroad, where they could do little harm. By the time of the 1867 uprising, the Fenian Brotherhood was a movement that was raring to go. And around 10,000 men took part in skirmishes during that rebellion in Leinster and Munster, the largest being in Tallaght in the hills to the southwest of the capital. To put it in context, around 1,800 rebels took part in the 1916 Easter Rising. The rebellion was unfortunately a military failure. and a day later the Irish Times newspaper called it a wretched conspiracy which they claimed had been defeated. But Fenianism would prove to be the only Irish revolutionary movement that was both defeated in the field of war and continued onwards. Fenianism was bloodied but unbowed. In a letter to the Paris-based magazine Liberty, written after the rebellion, Colonel Thomas J. Kelly defended the Fenian uprising despite its failures. "We are a people and a principle, that is to say, eternal and absolute. Can a principle be vanquished? Why, therefore, do they say we are vanquished? Did not Christianity commence by defeats? Did it not, like us, water the ground with the blood of its martyrs? Our movement is only commencing and is not about to finish." Kelly himself was arrested twice during 1867. His second escape in Manchester became known as the smashing of the van and resulted in the death of a local policeman. 3 Fenians arrested for this endeavour were later executed, becoming our subject today, the legendary Manchester Martyrs. William Philip Allen, Michael Larkin and Michael O'Brien had all partaken in that prison van escape on the 18th of September 1867. The prior mentioned Colonel Thomas J. Kelly and Timothy Deasy were 2 high-profile Fenian prisoners who travelled to Manchester to take part in a council of Fenian centres or organisers in England. Their arrests galvanised the Irish communities in British cities like Manchester and Salford into action. Michael Herbert, who has a particular interest in the history of the Irish diaspora in Manchester, has written that when both men were arrested on the 11th of September, this was a major coup for the authorities. But Edward O'Maher Conlon, another Irish-American Civil War veteran who was in charge of reorganising the Fenians in the north of England, immediately set plans in motion to free the 2 men, procuring arms from Birmingham and organising a party of men to effect a rescue. Conlon's party actually did succeed in stopping a horse-drawn police van, and both prisoners were successfully rescued and smuggled to America by the Fenian movement. That was an incredible victory to get Kelly and Deasy back to the United States. The problem was that in the course of all of this, a policeman, Charles Brett, was shot inside the van. In one ballad dealing with the affair, now a very famous song, The Smashing of the Van, it said, "With courage bold those heroes went and soon the van did stop. They cleared the guards from back and front and then smashed in the top. But in blowing open of the lock they chanced to kill a man, so 3 must die on the scaffold high for smashing of the van." As Herbert has noted, the police response in Manchester was immediate. The Manchester police arrested some of the rescuers on the scene, but they dragged in dozens of other Irishmen in the following days. The local police ransacked the Irish quarters, enraged by the death of their colleague. Before Allen, Larkin and O'Brien were executed for their role in the affair, they appeared in court, as did dozens of other Irishmen. And O'Brien struck a defiant note, telling the Manchester court that the right of man is freedom. The great God has endowed him with affections that he may use, not smother them, and a world that may be enjoyed. Once a man is satisfied he's doing right and attempts to do anything with that conviction, he must be willing to face all the consequences. When the men were hanged outside Salford jail, the crowd that gathered taunted and jeered them in their final moments. One of the Catholic clergy who attended them remembered a crowd of inhumane ghouls from the slums of the city. No Irish mingled with the throng. They obeyed the instructions of the clergy to stay away. But the defiant battle cry of the martyrs before their deaths was, "God save Ireland." The hangings attracted enormous international attention. Frederick Engels would write to Karl Marx that only the execution of the 3 has made the liberation of Kelly and Deasy the heroic deed, as which will now be sung to every Irish babe in the cradle in Ireland, England and America. He was right, until Auron Navíon, or the Soldier's Song, written by Patrick Kearney, uncle of Brendan Behan, eventually became the national anthem. God Save Ireland, honouring the Manchester Martyrs, was the kind of unofficial national anthem of revolutionary Ireland. With the men buried in England, the demand for the return of their remains was immediate, and in the absence of bodies, mock funerals like that I discussed earlier at Glasnevin Cemetery took place right across the island of Ireland. Marx and Engels were both sometimes privately critical of the Fenians' tactics in the years that followed, but they never uttered a word against the Fenian movement in public, and they believed there was the obligation of the international working class movement to not only support Fenianism, but to support the demand for an independent Ireland. Certainly the manner in which both Marx and Engels understood the colonial and anti-colonial worlds was very shaped by the Fenians. Engels himself wrote in 1869, of course Engels, so synonymous with Manchester and Salford in his own way, 2 years after the Fenian uprising, For a long time I believed it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy, but deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before they get rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. That is why the Irish question is so important for the social movement in general. Fenianism was a great movement which fused class questions with the national question and the national aspiration of Ireland. And it's fitting that we remember the Manchester Martyrs every year, even in this most peculiar of years. So, Gurv Mila Malgwith, thank you very much for the invitation to contribute something to this online commemoration.